We are here today with Holly Carter, and she is the head of BYKids, and it is an extraordinary amalgam of filmmaking and child and kid creativity through film and video in terms of storytelling. So can you tell us about the genesis of it?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Kelly. I'm happy to be in Austin, all the way from New York. We're hit by the blizzard, so much happier here today. BYKids was started now almost 10 years ago, and my background is in print journalism. I was a reporter at the New York Times. I was seeing what I call white man colonial journalism happening. I was having my own kids. I was falling in love more and more with documentary film. As a method for delivering story, I was finding that in most of my free time I was doing film-related things, and it occurred to me that allowing children to actually be the authors of their own story, particularly around globally relevant issues where, in my experience with journalism, the big media organizations were closing their foreign news bureaus, all a matter of finances, and some would say interest on the American part. My view of it is really that Americans want and need to be connected to the larger world, but if they're not being given an opportunity, that muscle gets weak and dies. And certainly with the financial situations that were going on with the bad economy, those offices were closing, and we weren't being given, as a democracy, full exposure to global stories. And so we devised this very simple concept, which is give a kid somewhere in the world with a globally relevant story to tell. These are kids who've had no experience with filmmaking. These are, of the 6 films we made, half of these kids have never had a computer. We deliver a plane ticket to a famous American filmmaker who goes to the child for a month, works with them to storyboard the story that the child wants to tell. How do you match visuals to that story to make a film? The kid is the one who directs, shoots, and narrates the 30-minute film, and they're then created into a public television series that was premiered in January of 2016. 64 million viewers loved every bit of it. So I think without knowing what the power of storytelling through a voice that, or voices that are very often not heard. We live in a culture that says kids should be seen and not heard. I believe the exact opposite. I think the adults should shut up and listen. Kids really are the ones that, in my mind, are the authentic reporters. They will see what's going on. They will report it without politics, without fear, without favor, and they really are quite authentic about it. And I think the other real power of what we've stumbled on is that everybody, we're really about strengthening democracy by bringing these international stories, but really at everybody's heart, this shared humanity and building empathy, what we all have in common, we were all children. And that there's something very disarming, opening, softening about hearing these very often very complicated, deep, and political stories, but when they're being told through the voice of a child, your heart warms, you're open to it, so that your mind kind of follows your heart. And I think, our mandate really is trying to use these films as sparks for social action and for social change. I think we're really starting to see some serious stuff happening with kids who, we're bringing these into half the schools in America through our deal with Discovery Education and the curriculum. People are just blown away by the fact that they've never seen stories told in such a personal way. It really impacts people, old and young. I'm not just saying students.
That sounds extraordinary. It sounds like that there can be no sharp objects in the room, when there's a child, and so that people can kind of a greater collaborative kind of thinking can start taking place. I'm reminded of another journalist, Robert Coles, who was a physician and then became John F. Kennedy's press secretary. And he worked with children who had polio and worked with stories, and wrote a book once called The Call of Stories. And you've mentioned the incredible impact that these kids are able to make on adults. Can you talk a little bit about about the impact of storytelling, what it has on them and their lives and the kids that they're friends with?
Robert Cole. So I don't know if you read it, but a friend of mine, and I started the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival because of Robert Cole. So it was originally Double Take magazine. We went to them and said, documentary always gets the third ring at the circus. You know, everybody pays attention to the features. You know, we go to these documentary films at the festivals at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you're laughing and crying, and that's the real stuff.
Right.
So I have a wonderful history with Robert Coles. I would say, to your question, the impact of storytelling is so fundamental to the human existence. So we all were born and bred to sit around a campfire and share stories, our oral tradition.
Right. That's literally 10,000. I mean, we were doing this for the last, 150,000 years.
Our lives depended
this
on
much
it,
has been not doing that. I know, right.
I mean, we're doing it on our phone, but that's not sitting around a campfire with our knees touching and laughing and crying and have multi-generational and having the kids participate. So I think there's, at this very high level of our civilization, which I think we're going backwards, not forward, I think we're missing the communal piece. And it's that piece of this experience where, I often relate this. A friend of mine runs peacekeeping for the UN. I met the very elegant Edmund Moulet. He said, what you're doing is extraordinary, and here's why it's so powerful. When you introduce a kid somewhere in the world, an AIDS orphan in Mozambique, the would-be king of Tibet in India, a girl who was displaced by the drug wars in Colombia, one of the 80 million tribal people. My bad education, I learned that there are Brahmins in India and untouchables. That's what I knew. I didn't know that there are 80 million people below the level of untouchables who, it's a very long and amazing story. We found one of those 80 million who told her story about fighting to be educated. So stories like that, when the light comes up on the very personal experience of being in the dark with a new friend, and you've gone into their bedroom and you've seen them laugh and dance with their family, you've experienced, you've literally walked a mile in their shoes. The lights come up, and my friend Edmund Moulet, running peacekeeping, he's like, those two people, wherever they are in the world, are not going to shoot one another. And if you introduce enough of these people as friends, war goes away.
What's interesting, the two things that are coming up in my mind. One is another artist like yourself, Ruth Asawa, who integrated, she was an artist, but she integrated her children into her art, and the fact that this came from when you were a mother and you'd been in this very adult, and probably at that time very adult kind of masculine world, and then kind of what you've created. And then the other thing is that you have story and then you have myth. And I just want to say that I think that you are going to make this into a myth, and that you're a mythic person, and we're just could not be more pleased to have you here and with us.
Well, thank you. It's an honor
to be here. We wish you every success, and we can't wait to hopefully catch up with you in the future and find out what other trouble you're kicking up.